And now I am back, and I will really have to request your patience, because I do believe, and it's probably because I am not only an historian but I'm an archaeologist, that it is impossible to understand World War I without learning also about all of the different aspects of World War I. World War I was not only on the Western Front. It had such a major impact on the world that most nations, from Australia to Russia to Turkey, from Canada to France and the United Kingdom, from Germany to Austria and Italy, are today remembering the immense sacrifices of their respective country, the nearly 10 million military dead and the 6 million invalids, not to mention the suffering of so many populations, amounting to a total death toll of about 36 million, according to some figures. The United States was the last country to enter the conflict. It is also the belligerent country where this conflict is probably the less known, despite the 2 million Americans who were in France in November 1918. More than 60 million soldiers from 5 continents participated in that orgy of violence. Almost 1 in 6 men died, and millions returned home with injuries or missing body parts, noses, jaws, arms, legs. This was really the beginning of plastic surgery, as well as the beginning of many psychological and psychiatric treatment because of shell shock. This monstrous conflict, triggered by power play, nationalism, colonial and economic ambitions, will put Europe on its knees, kill millions, shape the political map of the world we live in, and turn the United States into a world power. Around the turn of the century, of the 20th century, Europe was ripe with division and nationalistic movement, who were, in fact, the major powers in Europe at the time. Sorry. So, first you had Germany, a country with 60 million people, 12 million in its empire, who was the strongest country in Europe. Sorry, why do I have the Ottoman Empire? There is something going wrong because it's not showing the... No, you see, I see this one. Whatever happened. So, it has frozen, so something. So let me continue until you see the map. So you had Germany, which had taken after the war of 1870 a part of France, northeastern part of France, called Alsace and Moselle. It was part of Lorraine, Moselle, and which really wanted to become the strongest power in Europe. The tension with Germany pushed Britain and France, who had dominated Europe and had been enemies for many centuries, to come close together. By the beginning of the 20th century, they had much in common. They were not only the two real democracies in Europe, but both had a huge colonial empire. That was part of the picture you were seeing. Their political and economic interest would eventually turn them into allies. The big European power, wanting to protect their respective interests, had entered in a series of treaties starting in the late 19th century. Austria and Germany and Italy had created the Triple Alliance in 1882, not long after Germany and Italy became unified country. France and Britain signed an entente cordiale. Thank you, that's it. Thank you so much. Let me not drop it. Okay. So, that's where we are now. And so I wanted to show you the colonial empire because I think it's really important to see how much of the world was divided among the United Kingdom, which had 46 million in Great Britain, but 434 million people in its empire. France had 36 million people with 58 in its empire. And those were definitely important part of those countries. Then you had Italy with 35 million, Austria-Hungary with 51 million, and the Habsburg Empire was facing serious challenges, not only internal but external. It was, as you can see from all of those little arrows, 10 languages were spoken in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Every single soldier had 10 different languages. Most of the officers didn't speak all those 10 different languages. So you can sort of understand some of the issues that were happening in Austria. And then you had Turkey, you had Russia, and you can see the immensity of the size of Russia, which is more or less, there were some borders that were redefined after World War I and after World War II, but as far as the immensity of the country, and at the time it was a country which had 160 million inhabitants, but it was only 7% of them lived in urban area. It was in competition on the east with Austria-Hungary. They were fighting over territory, and in the west, and in the east, it was fighting with Turkey for areas like Afghanistan, and was also just had finished a war with Japan for the Sakhalin Island. So that gives you the size, and the other huge country was the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey, which has between 21 and 25 million people and was known at the time as the sick man of Europe, because it was losing one little country after one little country around its borders. While a German, French and Russian arm race was developing on land, and an Anglo-German naval race was taking place on the sea, other conflict erupted based on colonial conflicts and national aspirations. In North Africa, nearly 2 wars had started in 1912 and 1913 in Morocco, with the Kaiser telling the Moroccan to get rid of the French. So this ended up with the British siding with the French giving a small part of Togo to Germany, which you will see on the next on another map about Africa, and the British and the French realized that at that time war was unavoidable. So from 1911, the British and the French were convinced that war was unavoidable because of the German arrogance. Also in North Africa, and you don't see it on this map, it's more here, the Italians, sort of seeing what the French had been doing in Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, decided to invade what is now Libya. So what is interesting was that in 1911, the Italian Prime Minister, Giovanni Giolitti, observed, "And what if, after we attack Turkey, the Balkans begin to steer? And what if a Balkan clash provokes a clash between the two power blocs and a European war? Could it be that we could shoulder the responsibility of putting a match to the powder?" The match that ignited the fire definitely came from the Balkan, and where so many nationalistic ambitions were ripe. The Balkan had earned the name of the power keg of Europe. In 1912 and 1913, as I told you, there had been those two wars. When in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was the country where it started, you had a population of 200,000 Catholic Croats, 500,000 Orthodox Serbs, and 450,000 Muslim Bosniaks. And that is where the detonator of the war started, in Sarajevo. How did the war start? That was the first image. I'm not going to go back, I apologize. On June 28, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated with his wife Sophie Chotek by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist. This was really the trigger to the war. It created then, after a month of discussion, where finally Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia, asking them a certain number of points. The Serbians realized that the war was going to explode and agreed on every point of the ultimatum except one. But in the meantime, Germany had told Austria, if you go to war, we will support you. So they were really pushing Austria to get into the war, while the Austrians were eager to punish Serbia, but were afraid of a world war. Nonetheless, with the support of Germany, you got a series of consequences that happened in a very short amount of days. And you can see here that between July 31st and August 6th, the war had started. And you had those images, I had showed you those images of mobilization. Just a small detail, but it is important to understand as far as the number of soldiers who died at the beginning of the war, that the French had still their soldiers in uniform with a red kepi and red trousers. So as far as being easy to shoot at, that was absolutely wonderful targets, which is really very sad. So anyhow, let us go through the different events that started the war. So after Russia had decided to support the Serb, then it was the time when Germany, France mobilized. And then after that, the dominoes of alliance started falling. On July 31st, Germany sent an ultimatum to Russia to stop its war preparation. At the same time, Germany asked France, as a guarantee of its neutrality, to allow Germany to occupy the French fortress of Toul and Verdun during the duration of the upcoming war. This request came the day after the French had pulled their troops back 10 kilometers to show that they did not want to be an aggressor. They had troops on the frontier, they pulled them back. For France, having the Germans as the aggressor was essential for national unity, and also for getting the support of the British. By August 1st, Russia had not replied to the German ultimatum. Germany called for general mobilization and declared war on Russia. And having asked Austria-Hungary to divert the bulk of its army against Russia and not against Serbia, which was the original aim of the Austro-Hungarian army. On August 2nd, and you can sort of follow those movements on this map, the German went through Luxembourg unopposed and asked Belgium to pass through their country. The Belgian King Albert had already called for a partial mobilization of his troops. On August 3rd, he rejected the ultimatum as a flagrant violation of international law. Learning of the rejection of the ultimatum by Belgium, whose neutrality had been declared by London, London sent an ultimatum to Berlin. Also on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France, and on the 4th, it invaded Belgium. By the end of August 4th, its ultimatum to Germany having expired, Britain declared war on Germany. By the end of 1914, the rest of the world would be in flame. After the Germans had occupied Luxembourg, their troops were massed on the Belgian border and in Alsace-Lorraine. The invasion of Belgium, which had started on August 4, started French, British, and American public opinion. The attack was accompanied by widespread violence against civilian and private property. Several thousand of civilians were shot, many as hostages, to scare the population into submission and facilitate a quick advance in the country. Towns were also pillaged and destroyed in reprisal against the courageous stand of the Belgian people. This was very important because the stand of the Belgians allowed the Allies to get ready, but they nonetheless had to retreat, faced with a German onslaught, as German Grand Schlieffen plan to conquer France was put in motion, and the Germans took most of northern France. On August 20th, 21st, and 22nd, 1914, the Germans killed 130,000 French soldiers, 10% of French military losses to be suffered in 4 years of war. The Germans got close to Paris, but the French fought hard and defeated them in early September at the First Battle of the Marne. This is an image, maybe all of you know, which is an image of the cabs, of the taxi cabs. All the Paris taxi cabs were called in to transport the troops next to Meaux, where so to sort of go to the front line and fight. So on September 5th, some of the German troops were 23 miles from Paris. By 11th of September, the Germans were in full retreat. This remarkable change of fortune was caused partially by the exhaustion of many of the German forces. Some had marched more than 240 kilometers, 150 miles, fighting frequently. The German advance was also hampered by demolished bridges and railways, constricting their supply line. But they had underestimated the resilience of the French. Indeed, after the battle, General von Kluck would say that to see men who had fallen back 10 days, slept on the ground, half dead with fatigue, could pick up their guns and attack at the sound of the bugle was something we hadn't learned to count on, a possibility never discussed in war academies. In 4 days of heavy fighting, the French and German each suffered around 250,000 casualties, including 80,000 killed on the French side. The British expeditionary force had 13,000 casualties and 1,700 dead. In saving Paris from capture by putting the German back 72 miles, the First Battle of the Marne was a strategic victory as it enables the German it enables the French to continue the war. However, the German had succeeded to capture the major part of industrialized France, which was northeastern France, was really the industrial region. Furthermore, in 1914, the rest of the 1914 will bring back the deadlock that will then create 3 years of war and countless life. After the Battle of the Marne, the fighting moved north to Picardy to Flanders in a series of maneuvers known as the Race to the Sea. So the Race to the Sea ended with the First Battle of Ypres, where the British Army sustained 85,000 casualties, the French 850,000, and the German 670,000. But this was not all of what was happening. So here you see the French soldiers whose uniform later changed. I showed you, and I kept them too long, those terrible images, but you can understand why this was happening with the type of uniforms. Then by 1915 they changed and had this horizon blue. And then after the end of this move, this race to the sea, the French and the German and the British sort of went into position and went into trenches where they stayed really for the next 3 years. We also spoke about Ypres in Belgium. You can see photographs of the city before the war, before the German arrived, photograph of the city after the war. Now, the war was not only happening on the Western Front, and that is what it's so important to understand. It was also happening on the Eastern Front. The invasion of Serbia was really a succession of massacres on the Austrian side, on the Serbian side. There were so many atrocities committed, but finally Belgrade was taken. Then Russia had asked France had asked Russia since 1911, in case of a German attack, to attack Germany from the east, so to deflate some of the pressure that was going to come to France. So the Russians attacked the German, and the German defended themselves, and in fact won the Battle of Tannenberg and took 250,000 casualties there. So the Germans were engaged already on those two fronts. Then by the end, the big question was still, what side is the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, going to take? The Turkish army was being trained by the German. So eventually, Turkey took the side of the Germans. At the same time, two German ships who got stuck in Gibraltar went to Constantinople. And the German admiral, Souchon, became the vice admiral of the Turkish Navy. With that, Souchon and Enver Pasha, one of the most powerful young Turks, the young Turks had taken power in Turkey in 1908. So Enver Pasha and Souchon decided that it was time to go and to help the German against the Russian, to attack the harbor of Sevastopol and of Odessa in the Black Sea. So this resulted in Russia declaring war on the Ottoman Empire, and then, because France and Britain had an alliance with the Russian, on France and Britain declaring war on Turkey. And finally, on November 5th, the Sultan, Mehmed II, as Caliph, the representative of the Prophet, declared a holy war. So with Germany as an ally, the Ottoman Empire had become really a serious threat to the British Empire. So right away, the British sent a force in Basra, at the southern tip of Iraq by the estuary of the Euphrates and Tigris, to protect the Anglo-Persian oil pipeline, which was vital to the British Navy. And it wanted to have the Union Jack floating on the Persian Gulf. Enver Pasha also led an army against the Russian on the Caucasus front. Eventually, those were also terrible casualties, but finally the Russian pushed back the Turks inside of Turkey, where the line was established. At that time, Enver Pasha accused the Armenians to have enlisted in the Russian army and to be the traitor. This is one of the reasons that started the Armenian genocide. Then on the sea, because the battles were not only happening on land, you had the German cruiser in the Pacific, who became a threat. Then Japan declared war on Germany, using this opportunity to occupy the German islands and territories. Then the Australian and the New Zealander took the German part of New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago, while the New Zealander took Samoa. An Anglo-Japanese fleet tried to destroy the German Pacific Squadron, and that is eventually what will end with the first battle of the Falkland Islands, where the British had major casualty, with Admiral von Spray really saying that he was winning, but nonetheless this part of the fleet was destroyed, of the German fleet. Africa was not spared the conflict. I am going to go rather quickly there, but I wanted you to realize that the Allies attacked the German port in Togo and in Cameroon. And then what happened also in Africa was that in German South Africa, you had the South African, which were rather divided originally. They didn't want some of the South African, just coming out of the Boer Wars with Great Britain, did not want to help Britain. But in fact, Prime Minister Botha, who had been a leader of the Boer, decided to take the lead and became, as the head of the South African army, started fighting in German South Africa. It lasted throughout the war and even after the end, just after the armistice. There was a German commander, General Paul-Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck, who kept the fight throughout the war. And while the campaign had a small impact on the course of the war, 10,000 casualties, mostly on the British side, were affected by this battle. And in Angola, the Portuguese clashed with the German even before the Portuguese entered into the Allied war. So I've given you terrible numbers. All of those things were happening at the same time in those last months of 1914. This incredible bloodshed was mainly due to French commander Joffre and to the Austrian-Hungarian commander Konrad von Hötzendorf, who were convinced that an all-offensive warfare was needed, and they destroyed so much of their respective army in the first months of the war that they will forever be dependent on their allies. The only note of hope was that the Pope called in early December 1914 for a peace hiatus to celebrate Christmas. The government didn't want to listen to him, but the soldiers on the French-German front did. And that is where you had this Christmas peace, this Christmas truce you may have heard about around Christmas. Now we move into 1915, which is really the war of the French, of the trenches. It is the war of the trenches. It is a war where, for the first time, poison gas is used at the Battle of Ypres. It is also the casualties on all sides were absolutely terrible. The General Joffre was continued to speak about the French élan, which means the French way to push. You know, when you had those soldiers who had to charge and get killed, they continued to have their élan. One had to wait until 1916 and 1917 to start seeing mutinies in the French army. But the French casualty for 1915 were roughly 1.1 million men between killed, wounded, and taken prisoners, while the Germans suffered 660,000 casualties on the Western Front. What 1915 demonstrated was really the quality of the German armies, who had good organization, superior logistic, better training, and better intelligence. Then you had the Italian front, where Austria-Hungary eventually started attacking after the Italian had declared war in May 1915. The Italian had a rather large army, 900,000 men, but they mobilized things right away. In 3 weeks, 500 of them, and they put them on the border with Austria-Hungary. But you have the Alps then as a border. So those were the worst condition to fight battles. In the snow, on those escarpments, and during only the fall of 1915, the Italians suffered 170,000 casualties, and the Austrian 95,000. Then, by the end of the year, 200,000 Italian troops, 20% of their army, will go missing. They just decided that it was too much for them, and so they went back home. So, nonetheless, the Italian contribution to the war effort was essential to tie down a significant share of Austrian-Hungarian manpower on the Italian front. Because on the Eastern Front, the Austrian-Hungarian army asked for support from the Germans to fight the Russians in Galicia at the Battle of Tarnów Gorlice. In the Balkans, Ferdinand, King of Bulgaria, who had kept his country out of the war, once he saw all the victories of the Central Power, decided that it was time for him to recover Macedonia. So not only did he recover Macedonia, but he invaded Serbia. All of the Serbian army was totally defeated. They evacuated Serbia, and the French and British ships helped them go to Corfu, to the island of Corfu, and join the French-British army of the Orient. The King of Serbia stayed in Corfu. Serbia had been totally defeated thanks to the crushing effectiveness of the artillery. Then the Germans were trying to steer some revolution against the British, and the British, therefore, had to defend the Suez Canal. And so, because they saw this aggressiveness coming from Turkey, who were trying to get the Turkey, and the German, who were trying to get Egypt to get away from the British Empire, the British decided that it was time for them to finish Turkey. And that is when started the expedition of Gallipoli. Gallipoli, probably many of you have seen movies about Gallipoli and so on. The Battle of Gallipoli was started in February 1915, and it will last for about a year. It was, in fact, a huge standoff. At the Battle of Gallipoli, you had the British, 3/4 of the Allied troop were made of the British, the Irish, the Indian, the Australian, and the New Zealander, and 1/4 of the troops were French. Had Gallipoli succeeded, it would have ended Turkey participation in the war. But amid horrible conditions, the British, the French, and the Turk fought for 10 long months. There was a political crisis in London. Churchill, whose idea it had been, lost his position as Vice Lord of the Admiralty, but he remained on the War Council. Anyhow, at the end of this battle, the Turks had about 250,000 casualties, and the Allied around 150,000, among them 30,000 Australian and 10,000 New Zealander. While this was happening, the British were also fighting south of Baghdad. And the big point for the British there was that they were afraid that if they lost their image in the Muslim world, this will create huge issue in Persia, in Afghanistan, and especially in India, which they were controlling. So they had to make that stand. Finally, on the sea, after having lost an armored cruiser at the Battle of Dogger Bank off the coast of England, the Germans decided that they were not going anymore to send their navy out of their harbor. But what they will do instead, because they had many submarines, they will start unrestricted submarine warfare. This is when the Lusitania was sunk. It was a British passenger ship. It had about 1,200 people on board. 128 were American citizens. So not only did it harden the resolve of the British, it created a major uproar worldwide. You must be wondering why, at this time, no one was really ready to call for an armistice. Like in any other war, it would have been done. It remains incomprehensible. 1915 was called the Black Year, and then comes 1916 and the horror of the Battle of Verdun. That was a plan devised by the Germans, who felt now it was time for them, they could win the war, because they knew that the war could only be won as a war of attrition. If they killed enough people, eventually the French and the British would pull out of the war. And hence came the Battle of Verdun, where you see here those horrible images, which one after one, the fort which were surrounding Verdun were taken, the Fort de Douaumont, the Fort de Vaux. You see the utter destruction. And this Battle of Verdun was the most geographically concentrated and prolonging bloodletting of the war. But Germany had failed to bleed France to death, and from October to the end of the war, French offensive regained the fort and the territories they had lost earlier. The French acknowledged 162,000 dead, while the Germans, for political reasons, underestimated their figures and had an official count of 82,000 killed. The 10 months of fighting generated 377,000 French casualties against 337 Germans won. On a 10 square meter space, 10 million shells were fired, amounting to 1.35 million tons of steel. Verdun was a horror for the French. French were taken prisoners in droves by the Germans. The British came really to the help of the French because they started at the time the Battle of the Somme, which was as devastating for the British as it had been for the French in Verdun. But the Battle of the Somme really sort of distracted the German, and the inferno of Verdun could stop. The Battle of the Somme, Haig tactics there, Haig, the British military commander, really was following the same line as Joffre and Konrad von Hötzendorf, the Austrian general commander, because he pushed his troops so much to the front that it was an utter massacre. On the first day, by the end of the first day of the battle, the British had suffered 60,000 casualties, of whom 20,000 were dead. Their largest single loss was at the Battle of the Somme. 60% of all officers involved on the first day were killed. Torrential rains then for the rest of the year eventually turned the Somme into a quagmire. And bottom line, at the end of the battle, the British had suffered 427 casualties. The Australian had lost in 8 weeks of combat more than they had lost at Gallipoli in 8 months. Except for relieving the French in Verdun, the Battle of the Somme was pure loss of lives. No territory was gained. On the Italian front, you continue to have offensive in the Alps, with one battle after the other. Eventually, the Italian will have 12 battles on the Isonzo River, where no one gained any ground. On the Eastern Front in Russia, you had a major offensive which was successful against Austria-Hungary. By 1916, the Russian army was getting stronger and stronger. Then you still also had the war at sea. You had a continuation of some unrestricted submarine warfare, and then finally the United States pushed the German by saying, if you continue, we will declare war. So they've pushed the German to do what is called the Sussex Pledge, that the German will stop the unrestricted submarine warfare. And then you had another battle in the North Sea called the Battle of Jutland. And after that, because a certain number of German warships were sunk, also the German had less loss than the British. The Kaiser, for whom really his navy was like his toy, he had dreamed of a navy. He wanted to have this great navy, and he was petrified at the notion that some of this ship could be sunk. So anyhow, he decides that his navy will remain again in the harbor. So you have two events. One event, which is Sussex Pledge, they have to say that they are not doing unrestricted submarine warfare. Another event, they are keeping all of their ships in the harbors, which has as a result that the British blockade of the German harbors became so strong that in Germany you started having food riots, and there were no more supplies arriving in Germany. In Austria, the situation at the beginning of 1917 was also very dire, and you got also there many food riots. Emperor Franz Joseph had died, and his successor, Emperor Karl, sent his brother-in-law to France, Six de Bourbon-Parme, to try to start a peace. When the Germans learned about them, they were absolutely horrified, and they pushed the Germans so much that this attempt went nowhere. In Germany, despite all of the riots, the German Supreme Commander decided that all of the country would be geared towards the war effort. In Russia, also, the army was doing well. The situation for the civilian population was so bad, there had been so many dead and they were missing food and so on, that it triggered a revolution. But the French and the British were still convinced they could win the war, even if the huge feeling of patriotism that had engulfed the country at the beginning of the war had sort of gone down. So except for with, all other belligerent countries were really willing to continue the war, even Russia, despite its revolution. Because the first revolution in Russia, the revolution that happened in 1917, was a revolution which had a new government that wanted to continue with the war effort. But what the Germans were doing was that since the beginning of the war, they had helped the socialists and the revolutionary who were in Switzerland, like Lenin. And so the German, after the Russian Revolution, sent Lenin back to Russia from Switzerland by train in a sealed wagon. And then Lenin arrived in Russia, and that is why after, despite the fact that the Russians won a certain number of battles and their army was much better in 1917, the final Russian Revolution arrived with the Bolshevik gaining power and, in the end, asking for a treaty at Brest-Litovsk. In 1917, you have other battles, very famous one for the Canadian at Vimy Ridge, where they lost 160,000 casualties with the British against the German, who lost 120,000. Then you have for the French and the German the Chemin des Dames, which was also a terrible battle, where at the cost of advancing 3 kilometers only, the French had 187 casualties. Then you have the Battle of Passchendaele. So here you have the Chemin des Dames, and you can see the type of destruction. Then you have this Battle of Passchendaele for the British from the end of July to November 1917, where 325,000 Allied and 260,000 German casualty. Then you had the battle, and you had constantly the gas. You have the dogs and the gas mask. Soldiers were in flooded trenches. Then you have the Battle of Cambrai, which needs to be remembered because that was the first successful use of the tanks. And then on the Italian front, you finally have the 12th Battle of the Isonzo. I've mentioned to you the other one, at Caporetto, which ended with the rout of the Italian army. And finally, Greece entered the war. And as I have told you, Russian. Russia exited the war, while at that time the British entered into Baghdad. So that is in 1917 that you have the United States entering the war. And why did the United States enter the war? The Germans knew that eventually the US will enter the war once they resumed their submarine warfare. And they needed to resume their unrestricted submarine warfare to allow their country to get again some supplies. And so they decided that they needed to have the United States have trouble also on their borders, on the Mexican border where the Americans had already been for the American punitive expedition. They sent a telegram to the Mexican government. It's called the German telegram, and you can read the text here, which in fact promised Mexico that if they sided with the German at the end of the war, the Mexican could recover Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. This, much more than the resuming of the unrestricted submarine warfare, is what really decided the whole of the US population to enter the war. So, the war was declared. The US had only one division ready, but it came to France with General Pershing at the end of June 1917, and one will have to wait until the middle of 1918 to see the Americans sufficiently trained to be able to participate in major battle. But nonetheless, the arrival of the Americans and the knowledge that Americans could arrive and arrive and arrive made a huge difference for the men who were fighting in Europe. There were already Americans before that in France, and we should absolutely not discount them. You had many Americans that enlisted and joined the American Foreign Legion. You had American men in the Lafayette escadrille, and you had also all the American field service that were helping the Allies. You had many American volunteers, and here is the Lafayette escadrille also, which was flying with the French army. There is one topic that one will need to cover, but I have no time to cover, which is the major changes in warfare during that time. You know, from the time of the balloons, you arrive to the airplanes, and the importance of the aviation was really discovered during World War I. Then you have all those huge battleships. You have also all those aircraft bombs. And finally, you have the gas. So those will necessitate a full different lectures than we have time now to do. And then you have the tanks. Now we arrive in 1918, and I will be very brief because you have been extremely patient. And I know Steve is getting agitated back there. But I think it's essential to sort of realize the magnitude of this war, and that's why I went you through something which may have seemed very confusing, but at least it gave you a sense of what World War I was about. So in 1918, in the Middle East, you had the British enter Jerusalem. In the Balkans, the French are still fighting in Serbia, and they advance against Bulgaria, and the French reconquered Bulgaria for the Allies. On the Italian front, finally, the Italians got their revenge and against the Austrian, and they continue to fight but half of the Austrian army left. The Hungarians decided they had had enough from the war, and then the Austrian army was only reduced to half of its full power, and therefore the Italian finally, at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, won a battle. Now that is the arrival on the Western Front. Michel mentioned what this represented. All the French received those leaflets showing that the Americans were arriving without taking from the French people, that they were not going to live on the land. They were arriving with this, one American arriving in France has 10 tons of merchandise coming with him. So that you see them arriving. You see here the American divisions arriving, and those who serve in combat, those who didn't serve in combat. And you had 4 divisions that arrived before Christmas 1917, and they were the one who became the best trained of the American division. The Germans, having seen the arrival of the Americans, thought, by the way, no one thought the war could end in 1918. It was really thought that it would end in 1919. But the Germans decided that in order to finish the war, they needed to have a massive offensive in 1918. What I was saying, everybody thought in 1919, that was the Allies. The Germans wanted to finish the war just right then and now, and so they launched a series of offensives on the Western Front, which was called the Spring Offensive. 5 of those offensives. The first one was the second one, the third one, you see German cannons destroying Paris. So the German cannons were so close to Paris, the Germans advanced, and the German cannons were so close to Paris that you saw destruction in Paris itself. Then, the Americans started coming into action, and that is where you had those 2 major American wins. The one in Cantigny with the First Army in May 28, 1918, and then you had the Marines at Belleau Wood and Vaux in June 2015. Then you had the second Battle of the Marne, we spoke earlier, where in the Champagne, the 42nd Division distinguished itself under General Gouraud, and the 3rd Division, called the Rock of the Marne, distinguished itself just near Chateau-Thierry. And you can see here the image of the destruction of Chateau-Thierry after the second Battle of the Marne. Finally, the Allies and the Americans were pushing the German back. It is at the second Battle of the Marne that the German push was stopped, and finally on August 8 was totally stopped, and it was called the Black Day for the German army by Hindenburg. And the Allies were pushing back the Germans outside of France. First was the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, which was the first time the American army fought under American leadership. Then they moved towards the Argonne, where you can see how jammed it was. And there was some irritation at the American soldiers at that time, because they were still rather disorganized, as you can see. But it was not easy. And finally, you had the end of the war is approaching, because there were 3 major offensives launched. To the north, the Belgian and the British and the French pushed back the German towards Antwerp. The British led north of the Somme with the help of the French. There, on September 27, the British and the French attacked the Hindenburg line with a barrage of over 1 million shells in 24 hours. Finally, to the east, the American and the French with the largest army of three offensives, with over 1 million men, of which 600,000 were Americans, launched the Meuse-Argonne offensive. At that time, the Americans held 23% of the front line. Ludendorff's spirit was finally broken. The desertion rate in the German army kept climbing. On November 29th, Ludendorff informed the Kaiser that the condition of the army demanded an immediate armistice to avoid a catastrophe. Not wanting the army to suffer the consequences of the defeat, Ludendorff asked the emperor to proclaim a constitutional monarchy in order to have the peace party, who had since 1917 in Germany, you had peace party who had voted for peace, but Hindenburg and Ludendorff didn't want to hear them. So it was the constitutional monarchy who became involved in the armistice. It was proclaimed on September 30th, and that is the moment it was an armistice was finally signed based on, here I was showing you the German surrendering and looking very, very happy about their surrendering. So the armistice was was based on the Wilson 14 points and was finally signed on November 11, 1918. It was signed by politicians and with the Allied armies not defeating the German army. The German leaders could claim that the German army came victorious out of the war and that it was the politicians that sold out to the enemy. With the consequences that after that, here you have this Australian cartoon showing Clemenceau was a French prime minister with the Australian prime minister and with Lloyd George, looking at this child who is crying, and next to the child it's written class of 1940. So everybody knew what was going to happen again. So we are commemorating now the centennial of those calamitous years of 1914, 1918. World War I started modern warfare, created new borders. It liquidated the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire. American participation gave rise to the United States as a world power. The war birthed communism, fascism, Nazism, World War II, decolonization, the rise of Arab and Central European nationalism, and the Jewish state. Its dead could be counted in the million. We cannot forget the impact of this war on our country and on the world. It is our duty to remember it and to educate the generation coming after us about its causes and consequences. We live with those consequences today in the conflict in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in Asia. As philosopher George Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Let's hope that the situation we are facing today doesn't lead us to another World War I, and that is why it is so important to educate the new generation about the consequences of World War I. Thank you so much for your patience.